our dear friend Larry Johnson is here with us. Welcome back, Larry.
I haven't gone anywhere. You're the one that's the traveling dude. Okay. Go.
The first time, every time I was talking with you, you were in Moscow,
Yeah,
other
that's
places.
true. That's true. So, yes, I'm here.
Yeah, Larry, let's start with the meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky, which, after all, one of the major issues, which is the territorial concessions on the part of Ukrainians, it doesn't seem they have talked that much about it, or they had, they have reached any sort of agreement in that direction. But putting all together, Donald Trump every time comes out and says we're getting closer to some sort of an end to the conflict. What is your take on what has happened during the meeting and
Yeah.
aftermath?
Well, they're getting closer to an end of the conflict because the Russians continue to advance very rapidly, and Russia's going to win this thing militarily. As far as a negotiated settlement, it's not going to happen. I mean, this is just nonsense. Did you hear Zelensky say yesterday? Yes, we're willing to cede territory that we've previously claimed in order to bring an end to this. No, didn't say that at all. What he said the day before was, "No way in hell, we're not giving up a damn piece of territory." So, okay, they're not giving up any territory. The Russians have made it clear they demand the 5 former oblasts, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk. That's Russian territory. Russians have not backed off on that 1 inch. So what you have here is a fundamental disagreement that's not going to be resolved by talking. It's not a matter of, oh, they just don't understand what our position is. No, both sides understand the positions. The Ukrainians and Zelensky continue to believe that somehow they can retake or regain control of those territories, or they can stop Russia in its tracks. It's not going to happen. And this, I watch with fascination this media attention to nothing. I mean, they acted like something was actually happening of substance. Yeah, Zelensky and his team, they showed up at Mar-a-Lago and they spent 2.5 hours talking. But when it was all said and done, the Ukrainians are going, okay, yeah, we're going to have to make some territorial concessions to Russia now, uh, in order to bring this to an end. They're not interested in bringing it to an end. It's a money making machine, for God's sake.
Yeah. But Larry, what is the issue with European Union and European countries? Basically, I don't know if you read the support from Germany to Ukraine has reduced drastically.
Hmm.
But after all, you don't see that sort of change in their behavior in Ukraine. And if the support is not the way it was before, how you can continue with the same sort of behavior?
Well, I guess you're proceeding from the assumption that the Europeans have learned something from history or even know anything about history. They have, completely uh, divorced themselves from reality, I guess is the best way to describe it. You know, Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, these three leaders are I think their combined popular support, if you add up all of their support, they're still less than 50%. I mean, they're in low double digits, each of them in their particular countries. Uh, I don't. They do not reflect the will of the voters, of the citizens of those countries, but they are committed to keeping this war going. From Mertz's standpoint, he's obligated more by BlackRock. BlackRock, made an investment, even though it's not overtly apparent. Uh, but somehow they've got to salvage. His marching orders are salvage the situation for BlackRock. And we saw, what was crazy was it 2 weeks ago now they had a meeting in D.C. and who shows up at that meeting? BlackRock, Larry Fink, what the hell are you doing here? Because supposedly you don't have any money invested, you don't have nothing at risk. I don't think that's true. So, this fundamentally right now, what we're talking about is money and control. The West trying to figure out how it can retain some, piece of that pie in Ukraine. But Russia is the situation on the ground militarily is such that Europe cannot halt the Russian advance. And the Ukrainians are losing. It's just that simple.
And the situation on the battlefield somehow shows in all directions they're advancing,
Yes,
Larry.
yes.
I-
Along with Ukraine, Ukraine and the West keep up the propaganda flow. They claimed that they had retaken Kupiansk and driven the Russians out, and a lot of Telegram channels got all exercised about it. But you know, Andre, our mutual friend Andre Martianov, did a good video the other day, just ripping that apart. The fact of the matter is, Ukraine does not have the reserve military forces that it can deploy wherever there is a need. They have limited resources. And so when they go to plug one gap in the line, the Russians accelerate the attacks in another section of the battle lines. And, it's just going to continue. Uh, People are talking about, maybe in 6 months, the Russians will be, at Zaporizhia on the Dnieper River. You know, I think it's going to happen a lot quicker. You're going to see a more rapid collapse of the Ukrainian army over the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, we have today is December 29. It seems that the 2025 is over and we
Yeah,
still have the conflict in Ukraine. The way that Donald Trump is talking about the conflict and putting all together European, he says today he said that the security guarantees to Ukraine and major part of the security considering Ukraine comes from the European countries. Is not
yeah,
gonna.
yeah. I mean, it's just a waste of time. We can talk about it. The Europeans, they think they're going to be able to put together some sort of European force that will go into Ukraine and say, okay, to the Russians, if you attack the Ukrainians, you're going to have to come through us. Russia will not allow that. That's not going to happen. That will escalate the war into an actual full blown war. If the Europeans think they're going to do that, but the problem is they're Europeans. Uh, the average European, if you're talking about a citizen of France or a citizen of Germany, citizen of UK, great people, individual on an individual level, great people, but their governments suck. They are so out of touch with reality, and they think that they have military power. They do not. They're a bunch of weaklings. And if they think they're going to go in to secure Ukraine, and the ultimate the entire concept of the security guarantee is that if quote Russia attacks, then they'll respond. They'll come and fight on behalf of Ukraine. Not going to happen. So this is just people indulging in a fantasy right now. They're kidding themselves.
How far Europe would go in producing arms in Europe without being, dependent on the United States? Do you see that happening?
No, they're Germany. They're all betting on Germany to save their bacon. Yeah, let's get Germany start building those weapons. Only problem is Germany's deindustrializing. Factories are closed. They closed the Volkswagen factory recently, so they're going in the wrong direction, and they did it to themselves. Along with the United States blowing up Nord Stream and cutting off the supply of natural gas, and now trying to refuse to buy oil from Russia. They want to pay higher prices. It is damaging their economy. So we've seen that uh, across the board in Europe. They're no longer an industrial center of power. They were 100 and 110 years ago. Yeah, you could make the case there was some significant industrial capabilities, manufacturing capabilities in Europe. No longer. Yeah, the French got Airbus and they can build some planes, but it's all going the wrong direction.
Trump said that Rubio, Hexet, Witkoff, Kushner, together with General Keane, they will join a U.S. working group on
Did you say General Keane or Kane?
General. It's Keane, Keane.
No, no,
It's
not him.
Kane.
Kane, raising Kane,
But
the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
uh, as I read it, it seems that it's General Keane. Anyway,
No, they can't.
Keane. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's right.
Well, yeah, I don't. I have no doubt that
You
what you're
see,
reading.
yeah,
But
yeah.
Keane, remember General Keene's this
It's
crazy.
impossible. I know because I see him on Fox
Yeah,
every
yeah,
time he comes up with
yeah. He's with the Institute for the Study of War. I think what I heard when Trump talked about who his negotiating team would be, he said General Kane,
Kane.
Caine,
Mhm.
raising that raising Kane they call him. That. But again, this I can't see them sending all of those over to be quote the negotiating team with the Russians. We'll see if that even happens. They're talking about that now, but the problem remains Ukraine, and Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and Russia's not going to get suckered in again like they did with Minsk two, where they said, okay, we'll stop in place because we got all these Europeans saying that they back this peace process. No, it's not going to. I can't emphasize enough. People, go read what Vladimir Putin said to the Russian Foreign Ministry on June 14th, 2024, and what he has repeated, multiple times since then. What has been restated by Sergei Lavrov, what's been stated by the Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov. They haven't changed, and that's why I sit here and get just terribly frustrated watching a lot of commentators. Oh yeah, this is an advance. The peace process is moving. Maybe Russia's willing to make some concessions. No, they're not. They're not. Oh, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a good phone call. Great. Glad they had glad they had a nice conversation. Doesn't mean that Russians are saying, "Oh, okay, now yeah, we'll stop where we are in place. We'll no longer continue to advance militarily in Kherson or Zaporizhia, and we'll give some of that territory back to Ukraine." Not gonna happen. So and the West continues to you know deceive itself, lie to itself. Oh yeah, the Russian economy is going weak. Oh, the Russians are getting exhausted. They can't keep this up. Yes, they can. They're nowhere near exhaustion. They haven't even um, they have not mobilized for war. This is still a special military operation. And the simplest way to describe that is they have not declared anywhere approaching a full mobilization. They're maintaining and growing the size of their army through normal recruitment processes. And in fact, they used to offer, financial bonuses to get people to sign up. They're now they're now stopping that because they got too many people showing up to say, "Okay, yeah, we'll go fight." And they say, "That's all right. We got enough. Go back to work." So, 6% of their GDP has been uh, can be attributed to the war effort. Only 6%. Uh, during World War II, by contrast, the U.S. GDP was like 45% was devoted to war. That's when you're up into double digits and approaching 50%. That's when you're at war, full blown war. Russia's not anywhere near that.
I remember when the war started, Michael McFaul said that this is the Putin's war. And today we cannot it's obvious what's going on in the society, within the society in Russia. The people are even more, you know they want to be more forceful toward what's going on in Ukraine in terms of, against the West. You see somehow the Russian president, trying to do something in the middle. He's not going that far, confronting, NATO and the collective West. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
Y- How do you see, Larry, what has happened to the Russian society? Because you remember when the war started, the media has convinced that some young Russian, you know, eh, boys to get out of Russia, not stay there and fighting for Russia because that was Putin's war, that was a war of aggression. That is not the case anymore, even with the more liberal part of the society.
Um, Look, I've only been to Russia times in the last 2 years.
That's a
Um,
lot.
yeah. So
You know a lot
now,
then.
what do I know? Um, what I have not observed protests against the war. I have not heard, meeting with. I've met with a variety of people. I'm not just locked into one group. Um, the actually the issue of the war doesn't really come up much because it's not a war. It's a special military operation right now. That's how the society is organized, and what that means is that the average consumer, the average Russian, is not having to make a sacrifice to forego, food, or to be limited with coupons for buying gas. You go back to what happened in the United States during World War II. Uh, Nobody could buy a new car for like 3 or 4 years. No new cars. Um, they were limited. You got ration coupons for how much gas you could buy. There are restrictions. You don't see that in Russia. Now you're correct. There are some segments of Russian society that want Putin to really take the gloves off and just beat the living hell out of Ukraine. And you've heard that articulated sometimes by the likes of Medvedev, the former Russian president. But the, there is not this surge of I guess anger or irritation that they're saying, okay, we got to move quicker. Um, Putin is relying upon the general staff for the war plan, how they're proceeding with the war. And, do they make mistakes? Yes, they've made mistakes. I'm not at all arguing that the Russian military is perfect, but, they seem to be handling business pretty well. And they have proceeded. I've not been privy to their plans. So I have to assume they know what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish. Um, as I've said before, one of the things that has been a limiting factor on the performance of the Russian military was because it's not a war, because they did not mobilize on a wartime footing. They've relied on a slower process for building up the actual number of men in the army. And that has, as that number has risen, their operations and activities have increased. That's why this year we're seeing, far more rapid advances than any time in the previous 3 years. And I think that's only going to continue. It's not going to subside.
I think that shows how the Russian army has been transforming, somehow a defensive army. They were prepared to defend themselves, but they were not prepared to attack any other, to go outside of Russia to fight, something like NATO,
Well,
700,000 soldiers in Ukraine. They were fighting a huge force in Ukraine. But as you've mentioned, it shows how they have been trained they have been training during the process of war in Ukraine. And Russia today is totally, their army is totally different,
Well,
Larry.
yeah,
I don't know if go ahead. Go
well,
ahead. Yeah.
I lost you were talking and your voice disappeared.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
I'm talking about the transformation of the Russian
Yeah,
army.
well, when the special military operation started in February 2022, the Russian ground forces were estimated at 275,000 total, and they only deployed about half of that into um, the initial incursion into Ukraine. They had a reserves at the time, uh, I want to say 800, 900,000, or, ready reserves. Um, but actually, the numbers, I guess they, in theory, could have called upon 3 to 5 million. Well, they didn't do that. By September 2022, they mobilized 320,000. Uh, Now, here we are coming up on the fourth year of this war. Their army has grown to around 1.5 million. So it's increased by a factor of, um, you know, almost 7 times the size of what it was 4 years ago. Now, d- bringing people in means you don't just immediately, like the Ukrainians are doing, put a uniform on them, shove them to the front lines. The Russians do have the luxury of time to train these people. In fact, I was just reading that one of the problems they've got right now is they've got so many people wanting to sign up, wanting to enlist. They don't have enough training grounds available, enough bases where they could absorb all those new trainees. So, Russia's not suffering. They're not suffering losses in manpower. They're not suffering losses in terms of their ability to produce weapons. They're not suffering losses in terms of shortages of energy. So basically everything you need in order to fight and sustain a war, Russia has, and Ukraine doesn't. That's the fundamental issue. If you think about it, you say, okay, what do we need? Okay, we need manpower, people willing to fight. Russia has that. Ukraine doesn't. We see video after video of Ukrainian, recruiters going out and tackling people and dragging them into cars. Um, you need to have an industrial base that can provide what you need for the war effort. Russia has that, and they haven't even had to go onto a war footing. In other words, what exists within the civilian economy is still sufficient to keep them supplied with weapons and ammunition and new vehicles, new tanks, new planes, etc. The people have to be willing to support the war effort. Um, you have that in Russia. It's questionable how far that extends in Ukraine. There's uh, there are some reports that the people still believe that they can win this war. You know, so they're victims of their own propaganda. Um, Russia has all of the factors you need in order to sustain the war effort. Ukraine, without Western support, does not. It's that simple.
On the part of NATO, how did you find, Larry, all these weapons, different type of weapons going to Ukraine? It shows something, the weapons are not integrated into the system that was exposed in Ukraine and somehow. I don't know if that's of concern for NATO.
Well, again, um, when Russia builds weapons, they are built in, I guess, according to let's call it a national security strategy. They actually do have a genuine national security strategy, and the the whole military industrial system in Russia is not a capitalist system. It's not one where these industries exist in order to earn profits for shareholders. Uh, these industries exist to make sure that Russia has what it needs to fend off foreign attacks. It has been the philosophy behind it. Whereas when you get into the West, the various companies that build tanks and planes and cannons, artillery pieces and artillery shells, these are all capitalist companies. They're not they're publicly owned, or they serve shareholders, and those shareholders want returns. So the weapons that are end up being designed, developed, and deployed are not necessarily weapons that serve a national security strategy. And then because of how NATO is with 31 countries now, the industry in Germany does things in one way, the industry in France does things in another way, and the same with the UK. So there's no coherent focus, uh, and it's not like they're all producing something um, to a particular standard. They have different standards, different capabilities. So it's just this uh, Europe. Europe is not in the position that let's go back to 1930 as Hitler comes to power and Hitler starts rebuilding the German army. Uh, they had, at the time in Germany, they had idle factories. They had workers that were looking for a job. Um, today in Germany, they got a problem with energy. They can't you know they can't produce. They're shuttering factories, and a lot of those factories are moving overseas. So they don't right now have the capability in place to produce on a footing that would really build up the army in a dramatic fashion. And frankly, Russia's monitoring that too. Russia's not going to sit back and allow these countries uh, to rearm on the scale of like what Germany did in the 1930s, because the Russians are legitimately concerned that Europe keeps talking about attacking Russia. They keep treating Russia as if it's an enemy.
Without arms, they're talking about preemptive attacks on Russia. So
Yeah,
just
yeah,
imagine
yeah.
if they produce new arms. But Larry, let me shift the gear a little bit to what's going on with the meeting, with the upcoming meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. It's in
Hmm.
Washington Post reported that Netanyahu is going to press U.S. president during the meeting, and because he wants to attack Iran.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you saw so I wrote a piece 2 days ago based on a headline in the New York Post where it said, Iran declares war on the United States, Israel, and Europe. And I went, hey, that's unusual. Then you actually read the article. It was Pezeshkian was being interviewed. I forget which media outlet, but he said, "Look, we're effectively at war with Israel, the United States, and the West. We're not looking for a fight, but they're attacking us." He was simply acknowledging the situation. But instead, here's the New York Post, which has been carrying a lot of water for the Zionists, saying, "Oh, see, those Iranians, they're declaring war on us, so we got to be able to go attack them." Yeah, I mean, this was put out, 2 days before, this was done on Saturday. So, Netanyahu arrives today. And I'm sure Netanyahu's going to do his best to try to convince Trump, yeah, we need to go take another whack at those Iranians. They're serious about it, and the New York Post was being used, I think, by Zionist sources because the publishers of that newspaper, they're very close with the Israelis, and they carry water for Israeli propaganda. So yeah, they're trying to uh, create the impetus uh, to see if they can get Trump on board. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump will tell Netanyahu, okay, yeah, we'll see what we can do, and that they will try at some point to try to attack Iran again. Only this time, I think Iran is ready in a way that it was not last June.
And you feel it, you see it when you're here in Iran. And I don't know, Larry, when it comes to, they were talking about the Iran's nuclear program. Right now, they're talking about missile
Right,
facilities.
right.
So this is so ridiculous how far they would go, because that's impossible. I would say, Larry, here you see in the media talking with officials, you cannot believe that anything of what Netanyahu is asking for would happen anytime soon. If they go that far, we're going to have a full out war between the
Yeah,
two.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's why Iran, after the attack, the 12-day war, was it June 13th to June 25th, uh, sat down and realized, you know what, we need to look at our relationships with Russia and China in a new light. Previously, Iran resisted um, getting too far embedded militarily with either Russia or China, but not now. I've been jokingly referring to how they're racking up frequent flyer miles, all the Iranian officials that keep traveling back and forth to Moscow and to Beijing. And it's not it's people from the foreign ministry, people from the Ministry of Defense. Uh, it's not just one or two meetings. It's there's frequent contact. So Iran now is militarily, economically, and politically in a much stronger position than it was on June 12th of 2025. And if Israel is stupid enough to try to go ahead and attack Iran, thinking that they're going to defeat Iran and force a collapse of society, they may actually end up doing the same to themselves, because I think Iran is in a much stronger position now to retaliate.
And in you follow the Israeli media, they're talking about what would happen in the aftermath of Netanyahu's, administration. It seems that Netanyahu is gonna be, somehow. I don't know how possible is that to have someone in Israel replacing Netanyahu, because after all, and how influential that would be considering the foreign policy of Israel.
Well, it's I don't see any. They get rid of Netanyahu. He is gifted in terms of knowing how to manipulate U.S. Opinion, and then to get the support from the United States. But um, in terms of the policies he's pursuing, he's there's a majority of Israelis that support this. So it's not like a Netanyahu's pushing a policy that the majority of the Israelis reject. It's just the opposite. They embrace it. They just don't like Netanyahu personally, and he is corrupt. But Netanyahu goes. There's still. I don't see Israel changing course at all.
But after all, you remember the 12 days of war, which was so, short. Many people getting out of Israel, which wasn't the case, by the way, here in Iran. And
Well, right.
so a country of the size of 80, 90, 91 million people, they're not leaving the country. They're somehow unifying from within. And you see in Israel, people getting out, to Cyprus, other countries. So, it doesn't
Yeah. Well,
make
I'm
sense
I'm
to me.
not I'm not sure how much. There were a number that left around that period. I don't know if any have come back, or if they continue to abandon Israel. Um, the threat of war does, I think, may be an incentive for some. The problem is you got these settlers that they continue to try to steal land from the Palestinians. And the latest action over the last month, the government of Israel has authorized and approved more theft. And so um, the you know they're like a ravenous locust. They keep consuming, destroying. Uh, and unfortunately for the Palestinians, while they get some lip service from a lot of countries, there has been no concerted international action to try to stop Israel.
For such a long time, Larry, Israel was attacking Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, West Bank, and they were somehow immune from the attacks from outside. Somehow, I'm talking about. But you see, during the war with Iran, they have experienced something different, something that they haven't before. So I think that is still the case for the decision makers in Israel. Do they really want to experience a larger war with Iran? And how is that going to influence them and their society?
Well, I mean, when you're assuming that they sit down and rationally weigh out, do an accurate assessment of Iranian capabilities. I don't think they're doing that. And so they underestimate Iran's capabilities. They overestimate their own capabilities. And then when you act on those kinds of uh, beliefs, you can do some really stupid things. So as I was saying, I think last week when we talked, Israel has extended itself in a way that I think is making it weaker, not stronger. The, it's one thing to activate, and I think they mobilized about 300,000 reservists for the Gaza operation. Well, they're only a country of 8 million people, 7 million people now. So they don't have unlimited manpower resources. They've got very limited resources. Um, and that 300,000 man army has been incapable and unable to defeat Hamas. And they got Hamas confined to a 350 square kilometer area, and they've got them surrounded on all sides. But Israel hasn't been able to, defeat Hamas in that sense. And then they're conducting military operations in Lebanon and in Syria. So they've got there is a limit to what they can do militarily, um, and they don't seem to appreciate their limitations. They're acting as if they got unlimited resources. And I just, what's come out in the last 24 hours, Department of Defense Inspector General's report, there's like almost $8 billion in weapons missing. The United States has provided a bunch of aid, but they don't know where it's gone. So they're missing $8 billion, which is a sizable chunk of money.
Uh, Larry, a little bit talking about the situation with China. It seems that China is getting so much nervous about the situation of Taiwan, and they're getting prepared. They're getting ready to fight anything coming to their you know as they call it, the homeland. They see
Hmm.
But do you see the United States escalating the situation in Taiwan, or somehow Donald Trump going in that direction of sending more weapons, making new decisions on Taiwan?
Well, the weapons package that was, recently the aid provided to Taiwan, yeah, that has created greater tension with the Chinese. But I don't see China is not going to act militarily to take control of Taiwan. Uh, Not going to happen. They will do this economically. They will do this diplomatically. Um, they don't have to get into that kind of shooting war with the West over Taiwan. The it's like uh, on the economic front, as an example. they're going to stop exporting silver. So silver is now a critical mineral in the production of some key systems around the world. And so this is going to have a dramatic impact. It's along the same lines of when they stopped shipping rare earth minerals to the United States. Uh, I see China using economic means, withholding certain products and limiting shipments of other things as a way to defeat the West, as opposed to getting into a full blown battle. At the same time, they're prepared to defend themselves, and they're going to assert dominance and along their immediate border in those areas just offshore. But I don't think they see the need to invade Taiwan. They're going to be able. They will win control of Taiwan ultimately through a political process.
Because after all, they're witnessing something similar to what has happened in Ukraine. Sending more weapons, training the army, and then looking at Ukraine, Larry. By the way, I know that Taiwan is an island, is a little island that they cannot. They're not connected to
Right.
any
Right.
country. That makes hugely difficult for Taiwanese to go against China. But these are not, as you've mentioned, rational strategists or rational players. That's why China is hugely concerned about what's going on in Taiwan. And
Well, the what's made Taiwan such a hot button issue over the last 6 years are the role of NVIDIA and computer chips, and Taiwan's uh, status as being a major producer of computer chips. Uh, China is moving in the direction of producing its own now, and so at some point Taiwan will no longer be relevant. If the direction that China's headed right now, I think, could make the production center in Taiwan no longer as critical as it is now or has been. And actually, you see the United States as well under Trump moving to try to onshore, bring from overseas, return to the United States the ability to produce computer chips. But um, I think the Chinese have finally they've awakened and said, "Look, uh, the West is going to continue to try to hold us hostage economically in every if we allow them to have any leverage at all." So they've actually planned and are moving and executing on that plan to make themselves independent of the West, and it's happening. And as you've had your discussions with Pepe over his recent sojourn in China, traveling the old and new Silk Road. Uh, China is, um, it's something new and dramatic in terms of its economic power. The West keeps banking on that China's going to collapse any minute now, and their economy sucks, and it's just, you know, we can't even objectively look in the mirror and see what we are. We're so busy, criticizing, looking for weaknesses in others. The West, the I guess this economic competition, the West is lost. China has surpassed us in every category. There's nothing that the West has that China is now in need of.
part of their success, and I think a huge part of their success, is the way that they're treating other countries, the way they're approaching other countries, talking with other countries. They don't put pressure. They don't go, you have to do this, do that. The domestic policy, you make
Yeah.
some changes in your domestic policies. They want a better relationship with different countries in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. But the United States has not changed its attitude.
Well,
And it doesn't seem that they're learning anything from what China is doing.
the United States, we're acting more like a couple of members, the guys from the mafia that show up at the mom and pop business and, hey, we're selling you some insurance so your business doesn't get blown up. It's a protection racket. Uh, but that's that's been the U.S. policy now towards other countries. They're coerced and they're threatened. Yeah, if you don't sign up with us, something bad could happen. I don't see China doing the same thing. China, uh, particularly in Africa. When you step back and look at the role that the West, particularly Europe, played in Africa, they they didn't leave it better than what they found initially. They, they saw it as a place to exploit, to extract resources, to create pliant governments that would do what they wanted, uh, and not really build up infrastructure, not make sure that the people were educated, that you had you had power plants, you had good roads, you had good telecommunication. None of that. That's where China's coming in with this Belt and Road Initiative. It's building up that infrastructure, and they're not doing it in a way where they say, "Hey, you know, well, we'll come do this for you, but then you owe us." To make them dependent. Uh, it's a different approach. Some will say, "Oh, you're Johnson, you're being naive," but um, what we're witnessing is China's found a different way that they're actually making good on the promise of development. When I was going to school in the '70s, 50 years ago, um, there was the there was this real competition between the communist world and the capitalist world. There was a book written by Eugene Rostow, who was an economist. He'd been involved in the Kennedy administration. It was called The Five Stages of Economic Growth. And basically, it was trying to explain how capitalism, in contrast to communism, was going to create all this wealth for these third world countries, and it never happened, uh, because the United States was not really interested in building up the wealth of the countries in South America and in Africa in particular. Uh, we were still very much an extractive, you know, so much, a lot of the activities of the CIA in the early days were serving the interests of corporations, whether it was United Fruit in Central America, or the oil giants in Iran. That's where the CIA under uh, was it Kermit Roosevelt, played a big role in the overthrow of Mossadegh, and it was also about resource extraction, not building up and equipping those countries to be strong on their own.
Yeah, to those people who criticizing you about being naive about China, but the outcomes talks for itself. The outcome is there. You cannot, you see the outcome, you see the result of their behavior, their attitude, and you have to understand why are they successful.
Well,
That's the way they're behaving.
let's just look at what has happened to China in the last 52 years
Mm.
and to the United States in the last 52 years. Um, 52 years ago, the Chinese were not, the majority of the population were not literate. Majority of the population lived in poverty. The society was not industrialized at all. Um, and when you look at the transformation that's taken place in China on an incredible scale, with a 1.4 billion people, to build modern cities, to make a priority of ensuring that its children are educated. Whereas, in the United States, you could go to our major cities: New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago. particularly the minorities in those cities, they're not, they can't read at grade level, they can't do math at grade level. It's not like we're churning out great scholars. So these out of these cities, the educational institutions are hellholes. Um, the industrial base in the United States has shrunk. It hasn't expanded. The middle class has been severely damaged. We used to have a strong working class, blue collar workers. I came out of them. As I've said before, my father was uh, he started off working in a steel mill, and then became a maintenance foreman. He rose in position, and we were comfortable growing up. Uh, you know, we didn't realize, in terms of now looking back at it, I was I had two sisters and a brother, and my mom and dad. We lived in a three-bedroom house. Think about that. So,
Mm.
I shared a bed with my younger brother. Uh, my two sisters, they shared a bedroom, and my parents had a bedroom, and we had one bathroom. But, today that sounds crazy, but you know, we got along, we survived fine. Uh, and but that that was my dad made enough money that he could buy a new car every couple of years. Uh, we could take a vacation. We went on vacations about every year. Nothing extravagant, but you can still load up the whole family and go. Um, you don't have that now, not in the same level. And so here's China has surpassed the United States on almost every criteria. The United States is going backwards in terms of literacy. U.S. literacy, last numbers I saw said it was 79%. Not in the 90s. It should be in the 90s. It's not. China's in the 90s. So, um, and yet the West continues to try to portray China and Russia as imperial powers that are bent on conquering the world, and we've got to treat them as an enemy. And because we treat them as an enemy, then when they listen to what we're saying and watch our actions and they react, we say, see, you know, now we've proved it. And we don't take into account that we're creating that reaction. And we keep talking about an international rules based order. Hell, we just arbitrarily make up the rules when they suit us. We follow it only when it's to our advantage, and ignore it when we want to.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
All right. Well, the audience is going to be clamoring and say, "Where are your shirts, Nima?" All right. Well, listen, you
Yeah,
you you continue to enjoy your respite in Iran with your family. I know the
thank you.
grand the grandparents, they don't care about seeing you. They're just glad to have the grandkids around.
Exactly, that's the case.
All right, my friend. Take care.
See you, Larry, on Friday. Bye
All
bye.
righty. Bye bye.